Yeah, you're free to start now, Amrita.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this seminar series on inclusive trade, organized by the Institute of Development Studies in partnership with UK Trade Policy Observatory and Inter-Analysis at the University of Sussex. So when we look at distributive outcomes from international trade, we see that there are both winners and there are losers, posing the challenging question of what can be done about it. This seminar series endeavors to engage with academic debates, policy, as well as the practice of international trade and development, critically exploring the different dimensions of inclusion in trade. And we will continue this through a training course on inclusive trade that will run in parallel, as well as brings together various experts in the field. Now, today, for our very first seminar in the series, we have the pleasure of inviting Lucien Cernit. Lucien is the head of Global Regulatory Cooperation and International Procurement Negotiations at the European Commission. He has held various positions at the United Nations in Geneva, dealing with trade and development issues for several decades. He has also authored several publications on the development impact of trade policies. So today, this seminar, we will discuss a new multilateral initiative that proposes to strengthen the participation of least developed countries in global value chains, advocating for what is being called a new global value chains for least developed countries scheme. So without further ado, I will pass on to Lucien, and this would be followed by a discussion. We have Mattia Diobaldo from the UK Trade Policy Observatory, and we have Rafi Kaplinsky and Karishma Branga from the Institute of Development Studies. So Lucien, I pass to you, and we look forward to hear from you about GVCs for LDCs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amrita. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to participate in this new series, and I'm really delighted to see familiar faces, colleagues with whom we've been working in this area for so many years. And I also saw in the among the participants a very good experts, people from different backgrounds. So I look forward to our conversation today on what you rightly presented as a new idea to facilitate and to promote the participation of the least developed countries, the LDCs, in global supply chains. So I'd like to mention from the very beginning that my slides today, my presentation is based on a paper that I co-authored with one of my colleagues at the European Commission in my previous capacity when I was the Chief Trade Economist at the European Commission. One of my colleagues in my team, Alessandro Antimiani, and myself, we co-authored an article in Journal of World Trade. Also, there was a short version on VOC-EU. So I'm sure you could get a copy of the actual proposal and with all the details that we presented in those publications. So today I will try to keep it very short and give you the gist of it. And also, before I begin, I wanted to draw your attention to the disclaimer. So today I'm here in my personal capacity, and the views I will express are my views, and they do not represent an official position of the European Commission. Now, after these introductory remarks, let's perhaps begin with one important element, I think, in the discussion, which is to give a little sense of why we need to keep our minds and our focus on the least developed countries, why this special category would require, particularly now, renewed attention, and perhaps something that would help us really go beyond the many challenges that they face. So you see, it's a category that was introduced by the United Nations many years ago in the 70s, at the beginning of 1970s. So it was a recognition from all the UN members that certain countries face tremendous challenges, tremendous development challenges. They need specific provisions. They need the special status that comes with some perhaps some possibilities for them to benefit from many initiatives, including from international trade. The problem is that over time, as you see, since 1971 until today, despite all the efforts from the international community, the number of LDCs has not declined. In fact, it has increased, unfortunately. And 50 years later, the challenges that these countries have been facing all along have not declined either. Just to give you one example of a kind of a very difficult development challenge for a particular LDC and for their population, if you live in a country where 52% of the population doesn't have access to electricity, you can easily understand how difficult it is for those communities, for those countries to really connect themselves today with the realities of digital trade and supply chains where you really need to be connected in so many ways. So against these challenges and against the fact that this is still a growing issue for the development community to address, we have COVID on top of all these historical challenges. And here's a quotation from the former UNCTAD Secretary General, who said this when the UNCTAD launched their latest report on LDCs. UNCTAD does regular reports on the state of economic affairs and development of LDCs, and it is very revealing to see that, in fact, with COVID, when all countries have been severely hit, LDCs were among the most affected. They were already facing extreme poverty, and now we have a rise in extreme poverty in most of them. And to quote Mr. Kitui, it is probably a moment, a historical moment, where these countries are facing their worst recession in the last 30 years. So when we have all these elements together, the question then becomes, what, if anything, what else could the global trading system provide for these countries? And it's very important to look at what exists already. And fortunately, as I said, since LDCs were a particular focus group for the international community for so many years, we have in place a number of trade arrangements that facilitate exports and trade of LDCs. Just to give you some examples, this is by no means exhaustive, but we are all familiar with the various unilateral GSP schemes, these generalized systems of preferences that many countries introduced in support of LDCs. Just to take one particular example, in the case of the EU, we have arguably the most advanced, the most generous of such schemes. The name says it all. It's everything but arms. So every single product from LDCs has already has been enjoying duty-free, quota-free access to the European market for many years. And there's also, for some of them, a possibility to join these new free trade agreements that we're signing with many countries and many regions in Africa in particular, but also in other regions. So there is a lot already on the table for LDCs to tap into in terms of trade preferences. And other countries have also provided such schemes. It's not just the EU by no means. And beyond trade in goods, there's also this discussion of an LDC services waiver at the WTO in order to promote the exports of those LDCs that are, some of them are very specialized on trade and services. So these are all existing. So really the question is, if all these schemes have been in place, how come the share of LDCs in world trade has been stagnant? Because it has been stagnant. And this is also a big challenge for the international community, who set for itself, we all agreed as part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals to do everything we can to increase the share of LDCs in world exports. And there's a target of 2%. And as you can see, despite all these efforts, the share of LDCs in world exports is nowhere near this target, which would require doubling, in fact, their exports in order to come close to that important target, which unfortunately for the time being, it seems elusive. And with COVID, as I said, it's probably even more difficult to obtain in the immediate future. However, despite all these initiatives, it's also fair to say that it's not as if LDCs exports throughout the world live in a tariff-free world. So if you look at all the WTO members, all the countries and the kind of trade policies they have, you will notice that for some LDCs and for some of their products, they still face tariffs. So here I'm talking about direct exports from LDCs. So there is something we could do even in the very traditional 20th century trade policy where we introduce these direct preferential schemes. But the idea that I wanted to present to you today is more ambitious in terms of its GVC logic. So the idea is not to offer simply preferences directly to LDC exports. We've been doing that for a while, and you've seen there has been some positive impact, but not as much as we would expect. So perhaps there's a need for us to move to the next level and to facilitate LDC exports, not just from one country to the next country, but throughout the supply chain, to facilitate LDC value added to navigate duty-free throughout all the stages of production that complex, sophisticated products nowadays face, and therefore to incentivize companies to source from LDCs in order to benefit from this implicit tariff reduction. So the GVC logic would, maybe the best way for me to illustrate it is to take a very concrete example. And I like this example because many years ago when this idea came to me for the first time, that's how I pictured it myself. So that's why I call it the mango theory. So imagine an LDC producing country that has good quality, top quality mangoes, and they would like to export them. In fact, they do export them. What happens at the moment that these fruits, these mangoes, of course, they would enjoy the duty-free, quota-free access to the EU and to any other WTO member that has such a scheme in place. However, the moment we would import the mango in Europe, if any European food processor would like to create a food product, imagine a yogurt flavored with some mango chips in it or anything, a mango drink. The moment you process the LDC mango into a more sophisticated product, this product now it will originate in the EU or in the UK or in the US, whoever imported it in the first place. And if you want to re-export this product, if it faces a tariff in a third country, the LDC value will also be subject to that tariff. So this is the proposal to guarantee that for the value added that originates from an LDC, no matter who will process it further, no matter who will export it to whom, it will remain duty-free, as the idea is currently implemented in direct trade with LDCs. And this would result in higher LDC value added across the supply chain because it will allow for tariff preferences and tariff savings for anyone who would introduce in their production process LDC inputs. And it's not just a way of promoting the existing products. It will also, according to our results, which I'll show in a minute, it will go beyond traditional products. So I'm using now a very traditional tropical fruit example, but we have to think of the potential for this initiative beyond such initial export potential from LDCs. Now, the benefits for LDCs come from various sources. So it's not, of course, the most important one is the direct tariff reduction that the yogurt with LDC mango will face. If a yogurt from Switzerland to Korea or to Brazil or to any other country or vice versa will face a double-digit tariff, the proposal will deduct from the value of the yogurt the value of the LDC mango. So the double-digit tariff will only apply to the value of the yogurt minus the value of the LDC mango. So there is an incentive for pretty much every producer who could benefit from such tariff savings to buy from LDCs. And that will mean a big increase in the global demand for now what it will become premium mango. This is a tariff-saving mango, the mango that comes from Haiti or any other LDC. So this will really create a very strong terms of trade effect on LDC. The price of these mangoes most likely will increase. And there is a second round effect you could envisage. So the more value added you can actually source from LDCs, the more savings you make as a company who is involved in global supply chains. If you are a multinational, and if you would source anyway things from LDCs, there is an incentive for you now, an additional incentive to place some additional stages of production in that country. So think of the mango, instead of just taking the fruit, putting on a truck, putting on a ship, and sail away all over the place. You could probably do some minimal processing of the mango. You could probably peel it, chop it, freeze it. So it becomes now a product with a higher value added. So instead of doing these stages of production in another country, if the conditions allow, you would now have an additional incentive, and maybe sufficient incentive to overcome the cost disadvantage that LDC had so far. Maybe there was already a reason why you wouldn't do that in that LDC. It was for some reason, maybe that electricity problem or something else. It was probably economically not efficient for you to do it. But with a double-digit tariff saving that now you have throughout your supply chain around the world, maybe that's sufficient for you to offset the cost disadvantage that LDCs and the kind of challenges they face. Now, this is the hypothesis we worked on, and then we didn't just have a hypothesis. We put it to work and we tested in a CG model. So we used the standard dynamic GTAP model with, well, by now 2014 is not the latest database, but at the time when we were doing the calculations, it was the latest. So we simplified the database into a smaller number of countries and sectors, 24 countries, 30 sectors, 5 factors of production. We used as I said, the dynamic version of the CG model to allow for these effects to accumulate at the time. We projected these results. We took into account that such scheme would need time to materialize. So we projected all the way to 2025 with the usual variables. And we would like to insist a moment on this. We also wanted to capture this ability to go beyond the current production frontier in LDCs, maybe to attract FDI, as I mentioned. Unfortunately, in the standard CG models, in most of them, and in the GTAP run, the dynamic CG model, you don't have FDI per se. So we had to use another theoretically based proxy for that. So my co-author Antimiani, Alessandro, he has been developing with other colleagues such a sort of proxy for FDI attraction that will increase productivity. So we have this results also as part of our estimations. Now, here are the main results, if you want, in terms of export effect, trade effects. You could see that given the fact that this is a global scheme, and given the fact that LDCs benefit not directly anymore, of course they benefit directly, but they've been doing so already. They benefit through the exports of other countries. So every single other country would see a small increase in their exports because now their own exports will have saved tariffs whenever they include LDC ingredients. So, but the biggest benefits, of course, are for LDCs who export more of intermediate products that are now better integrated in supply chains. So we estimated somewhere to the tune of over 2% increase in LDC exports. You see also other countries having some results, but you can see the order of magnitude is very small. So it's just to indicate a sign that it's a win-win solution. So of course, a 0.06 increase in Chinese exports, it's a drop in the ocean. That's not really a direct benefit to China or to India, but it's important, I think, also politically to illustrate that this scheme does not come at the expense of anyone else. So it is a global win-win scheme where everyone stands to benefit a little. Nobody stands to lose, according to our estimates. And the major beneficiaries are, well, the GVCs and the LDCs, of course. It's also very important that if you were to be interested in promoting South-South trade, for instance, something which probably at the Institute you are particularly interested in, as I said, if you zoom in into the results, you realize that for some region and some sectors, this connection that you can create now with this proposal along the South-South global supply chains is much stronger than the average. So you have countries like the Gulf countries, Mexico, Korea, or this group of smaller countries which are not well captured in the GTAP, other developing countries. Here you have a much stronger participation of LDCs in the exports of these countries. So the value added that you would see integrated in South-South trade from this proposal, and that will bring LDCs closer to other developing countries, is much bigger than the average. Well, I already covered this point, I think. So let me conclude, since I am mindful of the time, and I would like to wrap up now. I think, what are the key takeaways? It's a proposal that uses already, and I think that's also very important for me to mention from the outset, in terms of its feasibility. This is a proposal that will use existing procedures and existing documentation. Think of the EU Everything But Arms scheme. For the LDC exports, for that LDC mango to travel to Europe, duty-free, quota-free, we would need a certificate of origin. We already need it, and we already use it. And if you look at the preference utilization rate, which is the key metric of the scheme, whether the scheme works well or not, these are over 90%. So 90% of LDC exports come to Europe with all this documentation correctly available already. So the proposal would simply reuse these documents. We would be able to reuse this certificate of origin that countries have already took the trouble to produce along the supply chain. So the yogurt producer, to stick to that example, they will keep the certificate of origin for the mango, and when that yogurt goes to Indonesia or whatever other country, you would simply provide these documents to the next supplier, to the next buyer, to the next custom authority. So you would extend the value, and you reduce overall this compliance cost for LDCs. So that's important in terms of its feasibility. Also, I think in terms of its appeal, I wanted to also use this opportunity to show my gratitude also to many experts, many trade experts. I think 40 university professors, academics, and trade experts, they actually sent an open letter to Dr. Ngozi to indicate that this idea, and perhaps with some revisions, would be important for countries to consider in the upcoming negotiations, or for the ministerial, which unfortunately now has been cancelled. So I will stop here, Amrita. I hope I managed to present it in simple terms, but if there are any questions, or if some of the elements were not clear enough, I'm happy to come back to it in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Lucien. That was really great, and for giving us the opportunity to learn more about this new idea. What I'd like to do now is to invite our three discussants, Mattia, followed by Rafi, and then Karishma. Meanwhile, I'll look at the chat window to see if we have questions from the audience. I do have a couple of points, but I'll hold on to them, and I'll see what our discussants have to say first. So Mattia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Amrita. Well, first of all, for inviting me to discuss this interesting paper, and thanks very much to Lucien. I thought your presentation was very clear and insightful. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to repeat much of what you already said, but I would like to stress this is an extremely relevant issue, as you reminded us that LDC's participation in GVCs is minimal and generally limited to the very early stages of value chains. Preference erosion is a big problem. With the proliferation of plurilateral and bilateral agreements, the competitive advantage that preferential schemes currently can offer to LDCs is continuously eroded and limited. Like even the GSP schemes, as you mentioned, they already offer rather good conditions, but it seems like the advantage is not that great. So what else can be done to stimulate further trade of LDCs? And so here comes Lucian's idea, which is to extend duty-free treatment, which LDCs get when exporting directly to preferences granting countries, to extend that to all the products incorporating value added coming from LDCs along the value chain, and do so on a multilateral basis. Now, my first reaction was that this sounds like a brilliant idea because it seems to have only pros and no cons, and it seems also to be quite easily doable, as Lucian sort of mentioned towards the end of the presentation. Because what it does, it offers a tariff discount to all the exporters that export goods containing value added from LDCs. And at the same time, this should then stimulate further demand for inputs coming from LDCs. Now, and the simulation of the CGE model shows that the largest gain is indeed for LDCs, but there's also gains for non-LDC countries. So everyone seems to be gaining. But is it really like that? I mean, my role is to play a bit the devil's advocate. So I have a few points I would like to raise. So the first one is about where does the main gain come from, right? The gain from Lucian's proposal, the trade gain or output gain, seems to be coming through two effects. One is lower tariffs on exports containing value added originating from LDCs. And this is a gain that will materialize right away, right? Overnight, if you want, after the proposal is implemented. And who's getting that are exporters, possibly non-LDC exporters as well. But anyway, something that happens right away. Then what we would hope that this does is it should increase demand for inputs coming from LDCs. And that's what we really would like to see, if the proposal is supposed to be integrating LDCs further in GVCs. Now, this change in demand is likely to occur. I believe that's possible, but it will require some reorientation of trade, of GVCs, and it will take some time. So basically, there's a bit of uncertainty there. But more than the timing of these two effects, I wonder whether, and I don't know whether the model can do that, where you can distinguish how much of the overall trade change or GDP change can be attributed to these two effects. Right? For LDCs in particular, I presume both effects can be at work. Right? In reality, that is certainly the case because of rules of origins and LDCs exporting products containing value added coming from other LDCs. This might not be much, but I think LDCs can gain from both these channels, particularly on goods such as textiles, where tariffs are high, and as long as they include some foreign value added, LDCs can get preferential or lower tariffs on these products too. So basically, what I'm trying to get with that is how much of the overall effect comes from an increase in demand for LDCs inputs. I think you're getting to that towards the end of your paper when you talk about value added included in non-LDCs exports. I looked at your paper, and it seems to be that increase or that change in LDC value added is not that big. At the end of the day, if I added the numbers up correctly, it's about $1 billion coming from the simulation out of 23. So it seems to be that the gain coming from the increase in demand is rather small. So I wonder how much the tariff cut is taking the lion's share here of the gains. The second point I would like to raise is, say there is an increase in demand for LDCs inputs. Now, isn't there a risk that this might worsen a situation which is LDCs being stuck at one end of the value chain? I mean, is this something that could prevent the lengthening of GVCs within LDCs? Because LDCs might be made more dependent on producing and exporting products for which they currently have a comparative advantage and for which demand from other countries is likely to increase. So this might just get these countries even more stuck in this sort of very initial stage of the value chain. Third point, and I'm almost done, isn't there also an issue of preference erosion? On those products, processed goods, final goods, for which LDCs are in competition with other countries, I don't know how this might be quantitatively not very big, but I guess that there might be tougher competition from non-LDC countries if now these countries get a tariff cut for all the value added coming from LDCs and that they process as well. So I wonder whether there's a bit of a preference erosion issues as well going on here. And finally, is there no trade diversion? So if demand for LDCs input is supposed to be increasing, is it going to be, is trade going to be redirected away from other countries? So can we actually say that nobody loses here? Maybe the net effect is positive as you estimated or simulated, but I think we should think of all these sort of potential issues as well. Overall, I think it's a good idea. It might be, you need a fine tuning, but thank you very much, Lucian, for putting that forward. I will stop here.
Thank you, Mattia. Lucian, should we take the all the points of the discussants together? Is that fine?
As you wish, I'm in your hands.
Okay, so I'd like to welcome Rafi, and then we'll have Karishma, and then we'll have the opportunity for Lucian to come back to the challenging points made by our discussants. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucian. You can hear me, can you? That was a very clear proposal. To use the technical phrase, the proposal is a no-brainer. It's absolutely clear and obvious this is what should happen. And indeed, I was one of the signatories of the 40 people who wrote to the WTO from the global value chain community, pointing out that global trade is increasingly in intermediates and to focus on gross rather than net values in trade and indeed in economic accounting was in fact taking us down the wrong route. So clear, I vote, and I'm sure we all do. But I would like to move the conversation on, if you don't mind, to the question of how robust is the growth of global value chains and the degree to which we're going to have an increase in South-North trade. So it's not quite your agenda, Lucian, which I accept, but everything you're proposing, of course, has to be set in a wider context. As you pointed out, this is a very severe and historically deep recession affecting global trade in general and the least developed countries specifically. And it's tempting to see that as a COVID event. However, I want to go back a bit and to situate the expansion of GVCs in a broader historical context. We don't have the time, but I'm here referring to the analysis and literature on techno-economic paradigms, which briefly says that from the beginning with the Industrial Revolution, we've been through 4 and we're now in the 5th of major sweeps of history, each driven by dominant heartland technology. They have with them a pattern of economic growth. That pattern of economic growth has infrastructural implications in how producers reach final markets. It has implications for social and political organization, whatever. Now, the central story of the crisis now hitting the developing countries, and in fact the global economy, is the exhaustion of the most recent of these techno-economic paradigms, which is mass production. And briefly, as you will all be aware, the period between 1950 and the mid-70s, the golden age, was a period of historically unprecedented economic growth. 2 things happened from the middle of the 1970s. Firstly, the gains from mass production declined, and the rate of productivity growth fell in all of the major economies. And secondly, mass production was a system depending on hydrocarbons. And that gave power to the oil exporters. And during the 1970s, the oil exporters wielded power, and we had 2 oil price shocks. The consequence of this was a fall in the rate of profit in the major economies, and I've documented it for the US, and it's absolutely clear. What did the corporate sector do in the context of falling rates of profit? Since they couldn't sustain profits through productivity growth, they took advantage of cheap labor in developing countries. And associated with this was the liberalization of trade, the GATT, and then the WTO. And for me, global value chains is an expression of the degradation and the crisis of the mass production system, paradigm. Now, that paradigm ran its course, and if you look at the figures of the share of GVCs in total world trade, it peaked in 2008. And for a variety of reasons, I think we can anticipate that the share of global value chains in world trade will continue to either stabilize or fall, but in particular, the share of South-North trade in global trade will decline because for a variety of reasons, production is moving closer to the final point of consumption. Not all production is going to be reshored or nearshored, but I believe a significant amount will be. That then opens the question of scale and specialization and what the consequences are for individual countries in a context where global trade becomes less important. And I think what we see is, if you look at the proportion of intra-regional trade in global trade, and if you look at it in particular in countries like, in continents like Africa, and especially when you strip out commodities, which go from south to north, from trade exports, you'll see that the share of south-south trade and intra-regional trade is growing very rapidly. Now, for me, that of course has both, as always, positive and negative impacts. I want to just talk and then briefly about the positive impacts. An increase in south-south trade is more inclusionary, in my view, for two particular reasons. Firstly, south-north trade, which was very standards intensive, had the impact of excluding large swathes of the population in developing country. You had to be literate, you had to be formal sector in order to meet the standards requirements of South-North trade. Trade into markets which have lower per capita incomes tend to be less standards intensive. And therefore the scope for greater inclusivity of the excluded and marginalized in South-South trade is greater than it is in South-North trade. Final point, the increase in South-South trade is documented to be associated with a massive transition in the source of capital goods imports into developing countries from other developing countries. If you look at the share of capital goods imports into Africa, Latin America, and most of Asia coming from China alone, it increases from virtually nothing in 2000 to more than 30% by about 2015, 2016. Now, this trade in technology is a trade in appropriate technologies. So to round off my point, I think that South-North trade and this massive expansion of global value chains is really an expression of the crisis of mass production. I think it's run its course. It won't vanish, but it will become of considerably less significance. There will still be specialization in trade. That specialization in trade will predominantly be intra-regional specialization in trade. Insofar as that intra-regional specialization is South-South specialization, South-South trade, I think there are potentially significantly more inclusionary components to South-South trade. Final point, something like 70 to 80% of all non-agricultural livelihoods in most of the developing countries are in the so-called informal sector. And all of our metrics on the measurement of trade and many of the instruments we use for the promotion of trade are geared towards the measurable formal sector. So somewhere in our story, we have to also think about this issue of the informal sector. How large is informal sector cross-border trade? How much of our existing policy instruments meet that agenda? Thank you, Amrita.
Thank you, Refi. Could I invite Karishma, please, next?
Thank you. Thanks, Lucien, for that very interesting presentation. And I think the discussants have also made some excellent points. I just had two quick questions for Lucien, and then some general observations and reflections, putting in perspective the proposal. So my first question was around the assumptions of the CGE modeling. So we know that one of the standard critiques of the CGE model is that it is based on perfect competition. So I'm wondering if you can just clarify whether or not you were able to account for imperfect competition in the model, and what that really means for the magnitude of predicted gains in the proposal that you reach at. And my second question, and also building upon what Mattia mentioned, was looking at this trade diversion. To me, it's particularly interesting to look at Nepal and Bangladesh, right, that are set to graduate from the LDC status. So are we going to see a disruption of the existing value chains, particularly if you look at garments value chains, where Bangladesh and Nepal are quite integrated? So are we going to see a trade diversion and disruption along the existing value chains as a result of now Nepal and Bangladesh in a few years not having that LDC status and thereby being sort of excluded from this proposal? And then just some reflections. So the first point was around this fact that there are some studies in the recent times that have found that that it is actually the non-tariff barriers which are critical impediment towards GVC trade, including weak logistics, transportation and infrastructure, lack on clarity on the rules of origin that you mentioned, as well as standards and compliance issues, particularly when you look at the agro-processing sector, like the mango example that you were giving. And if I think back to some of my own work that I've done on linking Lesotho and Mozambique to South Africa's manufacturing value chains, we found that it wasn't the tariffs that were the issue, or these countries were even supplying cost competitive intermediate inputs, could supply. But they were not integrated into South Africa's value chain, primarily due to supply constraints and challenges on the supply side. So I think there's also, quite an important and complementary role of having that sort of inward FDI into those targeted sectors and to build the productive capacity of LDCs in those sectors. So building the productive capacity and supply side in those sectors. And my second observation was that we know that the few LDCs have been quite successful into linking into some of these value chains like garments. But I think only Bangladesh has been able to quite successfully and actively embed domestic-owned firms into these global garments chains. Whereas in the rest of the cases, it's largely transnational corporations and their sort of subsidiaries. So I think it's also very important to facilitate those sort of domestic linkages and embed local domestic-owned firms into these garment value chains, I think, to kind of realize the employment benefits of linking into these value chains. And my last point was around kind of broadening the discussion up a bit and linking into what Rafi was also mentioning before, that we also need to look at the prospects for economic and social upgrading in these chains. And particularly more so now with digital technologies rapidly transforming the global trade landscape. And I can see some potential of digital technologies in the proposal that you mentioned as well. For instance, blockchains for doing that traceability or digital traceability of the value added from LDCs. But realistically, these countries are still grappling with the analog trade infrastructure, let alone having those sort of capabilities to now develop and look at digital infrastructure to facilitate that sort of traceability. And lastly, we know that digital technologies are also rapidly restructuring the value chains. There is increasing reshoring of manufacturing happening and limited opportunities of offshoring, manufacturing offshoring to these LDCs in developing countries. And so my fear is that as digitalization takes over the manufacturing value chains, what we're going to see happen is a sort of amplifying of the value added gap between the low cost commodified work that the LDCs are going to perform and the small high tech knowledge intensive work performed by the developed or the high income countries. And we see that LDCs will use digital technologies, for instance, to maybe improve productivity gains or to attain some sort of benefits in the production process. But it is the lead firms in the high income countries which are going to and are already unlocking entirely new and different business models as a result of these technologies. And so to say, we're going to see a sort of deepening of that smile curve, right? So that value added gap between LDCs and high income countries. So I think it's also very important as a complementary stream to look at these sort of forward-looking policies when we talk about industrialization in GVCs, which can help LDCs to broaden their industrial base and also support their local innovation systems and digital capabilities to not just link into value chains, but actually to make those sort of gainful linkages.
Thank you, Karishma. I think we've lost you there, but
hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
to come back to us now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I didn't hear that, Amrita. Do you want me to respond now?
Yes, please. Sorry, I was,
Okay.
yeah, please.
Well, let me try, in the interest of time, since I saw there are some questions in the chat from the participants, I'll try to be very, very telegraphic, very to the point, to respond to everything I heard from the discussion. So many thanks for taking the time to look into this proposal, to all of you. I think really, the first thing I'd like to say is that one should understand a few things, that this is not a silver bullet for transforming LDCs into the most developed countries in the world. Nobody has claimed so. This is not a proposal that will end poverty. Nobody said so. This is not a proposal that cannot be complemented by other much needed reforms. Nobody said so. The only question we're looking at least from my perspective and my co-author perspective, was given the existing rules in international trade, is there anything, and I mean anything, that policymakers could do to help LDCs? Will it be tremendous? Maybe yes, maybe not. Will it be positive? I think that's the most important question. Will it be net beneficiary for some of the most vulnerable, the millions of people living in LDCs who depend on their export earnings as small farmers or workers in a metal factory that sends widgets around the world? Even from an LDC, there are companies who manage to export metallic products. So the question is, we're in front of a very basic proposition here. I mean, option number one, do nothing as policymakers. Option number two, try something that builds upon the existing elements, or come with other proposals. So I'm sure there would be, this is not the ultimate proposal to help LDCs integrate in supply chains. This is just one idea. So I think if we set the expectations right, if this is the frame in which we're going to discuss this proposal, then it will be easier for us to assess it on its merits. Now, let me reply much more specifically to the questions from Mattia, because he raised a very important question, and I think I wanted to share with all of you one slide which I did not introduce here, but I have it. We published, as I said, different versions of this paper, and one of them is published by the Enhanced Integrated Framework. So I'm trying to find that chart that shows actually that the top LDC sectoral exports with the highest increase in value added are textiles, metal products, other primary products, chemicals, lots of other sectors. And in total, the value added, if we did our calculations right, Mattia, we are to the tune of over $5 billion annually in value added. So is this a game changer? Well, as I said, it's not going to provide a solution to everything, but it is a net contribution to people who really need more resources to develop. Now, what about trade diversion? That was another question. Well, of course, whenever you change trade policy parameters, there will be probably companies or sectors that will be under pressure. And does that mean that there is no company in any country in the world that may stand to lose its current market share if this proposal is going to be introduced? No, that's not true. Will mango producers in other countries feel some pressure? Probably, of course, unless all of a sudden we all going to eat a lot more mango flavored yogurts, and that increases overall, expands the global demand, which, by the way, if you reduce prices enough, that might be an effect. But let's assume that there will be some specific, sector-specific or company-specific trade aversion in some countries. I think for a country that is committed to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, if you have in front of you a proposal that does not reduce your overall welfare as a country, and you can actually support a goal you already subscribed to help LDCs, that's not to be discarded. And think of the LDC value in world trade. Remember, it's around 1%. Take even mangoes. I mean, I don't know by heart what's the value of LDCs in mango. It may be more than 1%, say 2%, 3%. I think, and here's the key question that we got in front of us. How will the proposal work? Well, I believe that one of the most important drivers of the proposal is through price changes, what I call in terms of trade, the ability of LDC products to attract a price premium. Why? Well, simply because LDCs have supply constraints. So no matter what their share is, it's small anyway. So you producing mass global trade aversion by just trying to really be the one who will buy the mango from LDCs, because there are not that many anyway. So everybody, 140 countries will compete for LDC-based mangoes. So there's going to be a significant price increase, very close to the tariff that you can save. Of course, not the pass-through effect of that double-digit tariff on a mango, yogurt, or on a textile product will not be all captured by LDCs. But because of this very important global competition for LDC cotton or for LDC mangoes, a lot of this double-digit tariff revenue will be in fact transmitted or through price dynamics to LDCs, and there will be competition in such a market. So I think this is the main immediate effect, and this is where I think we don't need to wait for FDI effects, this what we call second round effects to kick in. That may be the bonus, the cherry on the cake, but the immediate effect, as Matthias said, it could happen as soon as you all put in place these tariff schemes in place. This would trickle down to LDC producers or to a significant degree. Now, compliance standards, the fact that LDCs, the tariffs are not the biggest barrier, absolutely. But this is the actual idea that we try to give LDC direct tariff preferences, and it didn't work. Of course, LDCs will probably have a very hard time to produce yogurt flavor mango in Haiti. And that's why you can give people duty-free, quota-free for yogurt, but they will not be able to produce it. The proposal says, look, you can rely on Danone, you can rely on whoever manages to produce this at top quality standards with very sophisticated supply chains. And now you get a bigger pie, a part of that pie, because now you get a price premium, and whatever the share is of that additional benefits, they will have to give it to you because they are in competition for that mango with many other producers. So if they don't give it to you, there will be someone else who will offer you a better price. So LDCs can actually participate in yogurt standards, in yogurt supply chains or any other sophisticated product without the need for them to be able to apply those standards, because the production will not necessarily happen there. If in the longer term, they would be well placed to attract more production phases in their country, as I mentioned with my FDI example with processing of the mango, of course, it will make perfect economic sense for operators to place that production in LDCs. But let's be real. There is a reason why such production doesn't take place in LDCs. And no matter what kind of scheme you're going to put in place, it's not going to be easy for that to happen. But if you allow time, and if countries, LDCs, with these new tariff revenues, they would be able to improve their infrastructure. They could invest in schools, in roads. I mean, this is also government revenue at the end of the day, because this will be also subject to government revenue in LDC countries. So there is this long-term development effect that we can have trade policy contribute to it. So really the question is very simple. Do we want trade policy to have another go and try to contribute to development or not, without claiming that we can actually fix all the problems in the world? Thank you.
Thank you, Lucien. I'm looking at the questions in the chat window, so I'm going to pick them, and I'll cheekily also add some of my points, if that's okay. So thank you very much again. I think it's clear that you've clarified that this is by no means a silver bullet. So not all the answers and the solutions are in trade and trade policy, but the overall net welfare effects, the immediate ones, are important. I think the need to identify also in parallel the specific complementary policies which can either incentivize diversification to higher value added over time. I think the dynamic component of this is definitely something to note. So I have these 2 points that I've picked up from the chat window. The first is, I think, a point that also Rafi made about informality. A lot of activities and production and etc. Comes or links in with the informal domain. How do we account for that? And a second point which somebody made, but also was in what Karishma said, is the role for digital. And I now, I of course know that not all of this can be accounted in the modeling, but I wonder how can we better reflect or maybe link this proposal with these sort of complementary policies going forward. Thank you.
Yeah, well, these are very important issues. I didn't mention it today, and we do say in the paper that, of course, one should try to minimize the additional administrative costs that one would incur by making thicker the type of paperwork you have to kind of take with you along the supply chains. Now, there's yet another certificate that you need to be mindful. This certificate of origin for the mango, from the yogurt, etc. So, of course, this is a problem in itself for the trade community. You look at all these examples. If you ask Maersk or the Port of Rotterdam, they'll tell you that even today, for any trade transaction, you have probably 200 pages of documentation that has to be alongside with that container before you clear customs. And for that particular global challenge, of course, we have trade facilitation initiatives. Blockchain is the new, perhaps would be the new container. It will have the same historical impact on trade facilitation as container had 40, 50 years ago on trade. There are big hopes that digitalization of trade formalities will go to the next level with blockchain. And I am among those who believe that it is actually feasible. So when that digital infrastructure for trade facilitation will be in place, it goes without saying that this would naturally follow and fit perfectly with that. But again, this doesn't mean that without blockchain, the benefits of this proposal cannot materialize. Just as today, without blockchain, over 90% of LDC exports to the EU, they benefit, they don't pay tariffs, and they show us the paper documents, and that's fine. They can handle it. If they can handle it today, I'm sure Danone can handle it as well when they pass on that mango later on in the supply chain. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. But of course, you're absolutely right. Digitalization would reduce the cost and overall increase the appeal for such global supply trade policy change. So now, on complementary measures, of course, informality and all the other things, it's hard to put everything in a CG model. And of course, the CG model assumes that you, well, in fact, to be honest, in the CG model, in the standard CG model, we don't even have rules of origin per se, explicitly modeled. So there are many assumptions that we have to take in any modeling attempt of reality. And the assumption here was that you would have the documents. Of course, if you manage to cross borders with no questions asked and no documents, in fact, you are in the perfect world. For you, the border doesn't exist, right? So maybe informality is not so bad after all. If it works, it means people found an unfortunate solution, because it probably is not the legal one, but it's a solution to a problem that if you were to solve it legally, it would be even more difficult or insurmountable. Our idea here is about global supply chains. And I start from the assumption that on global supply chains, the level of informality is minimal, if not present, I guess. So it may not, again, solve this issue, informality, the fact that many companies are forced to work in the informal sector. It's not ideal. But as I said, I think we have to focus on the participation of LDCs in formal global supply chains. That's what we're talking about.
Thank you very much, Lucien. With that, we'll draw this very interesting discussion to a close, I'm afraid. But thank you, everybody, for your time. And I'm sure we're going to continue this discussion on other platforms. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lucian.
Thanks for the excellent comments to Mattia and all the other participants.
Thanks to you, but we do believe it's a great idea. So we're trying to find
Perfect. Thanks.
small issues. Bye bye.